From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. So from where we sit here on this Thursday, February 19th, just 4 or 5 days from the official election day, it seems pretty safe to predict that Mayor Emanuel is going to find those extra 4 or 5 points that he needs to roll to re-election on Tuesday night. We could run through the list, the president choppering in on a brutally cold day to confer national monument status on Pullman, the mayor's energetic embrace of a presidential library on the south side. How about yesterday's announcement? This is a good one. Yesterday's announcement that BP is going to stop, or at least kind of promise that it'll maybe stop sometime this summer shipping its tar sand waste into Chicago. These are all the things that portray our mayor as a connected, hyperactive, can-do kind of guy. And now it looks like he's going to dump more than $1 million into TV, $1 million just this weekend alone, which will make you very proud to be a CAN TV watcher because we're not getting any of those commercials. You won't see them here. My guess is starting Wednesday, he's going to be able to focus his real attention where he really wants to. The $20 million he probably has left in his various PACs and campaign funds, he's going to put that into vanquishing those few remaining enemies, the ones who've made it into runoffs in some of the wards. Oh, I wouldn't want to be one of those people. Anyway, through the past 4 years, there's been no issue that's defined Rahm Emanuel more than education. As we know, he loves to print press releases, and we've seen scores and scores of them. He brags about record high test scores, graduation rates, extended school hours, kindergarten, you've seen it all. So what's the big picture? As we approach this election, are Chicago's children getting a better shot at a good education today than they were 5 or 10 years ago? Well, there's one very interesting side effect of Chicago's, 30-year education crisis now. It has spawned some very good journalism, and we're all the beneficiaries of a small collection of print and online and broadcast reporters who really have labored to keep us informed. And one of those people, in fact, the one that I probably admire, I can't say most, but I admire as much as anybody in this field, is Linda Lutton. And Linda Lutton is joining us today, WBEZ ace reporter on education issues. And Linda, it is a real pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thanks, Ken. I'm happy to be here.
And we wanted to just bring you in today because, it's a kind of an artifice, I guess, in a way. But what we're saying is, we now have a 4-year snapshot of the Rahm Emanuel administration, and he came in saying that education was going to be his highest or one of his highest priorities, and he certainly has accomplished things. So now we have to look at what those accomplishments are. And if you will indulge me in this, I want to start sometime like last July, I think it was, when you dropped the story on the Big Sort, right? The Big Sort story.
Right, yeah.
Well, this to me was a defining piece of journalism about where Chicago is at, because you stood back and went through tens of thousands of records and came to the conclusion, if I can maybe quote you back to yourself, you said low-scoring students and high-scoring students in particular are attending completely different high schools. Other schools enroll a glut of average kids. In other words, what we've done is we've put all our kids into almost like demographically separated or achievement separated high schools.
Yeah, and that's what that story was about. And really that story and a couple of other stories that I did right before I left to go on a fellowship that I'm currently working on.
Yeah, that's why we haven't heard you on the radio for a while, right?
That's why, because I'm working on a 2014-15 Spencer Fellowship for Education Reporting. Mm-hmm. So I've been between New York and Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And I'll be coming out with a hour of radio. That's what I've promised anyways, an hour of radio at the end of my study.
So give me a year off and I'll give you a good hour, a really good hour, right? Yeah.
But before I left, the Big Sort, and one other story that I did looking at neighborhood elementary schools and what's happened to our neighborhood elementary schools, those were two stories that we worked on at WBEZ that I think tell Chicagoans how our overall school system is changing and shifting. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, Rahm Emanuel's last 4 years. I think if you put it into a broader context, I mean, Emmanuel has really continued with a set of policies that were begun under Mayor Daley, and that really are happening in big cities all over the country. We're expanding school choice, and we've opened many, many new schools, new options, and that's been an attempt to improve schools overall, and both on the elementary school side and the high school side. And those policies, the school choice policies, have consequences, sometimes unexpected consequences. And the stories look at sort of what's happened, and they really look far back. In the case of the Big Sort, which was looking at high school students, where do they choose to go to high school? And that looked at 26,000 freshmen, all the freshmen in the school district. It just so happened that one year we gave them a test as they walked in the door to high school. Now, this is a test that they had also taken the prior spring as 8th graders, and that's usually when we'd given them that test for the past few years. But I think it was Barbara Bird Bennett's first year. That year, we gave all the freshmen that exam. What that allowed me to do is connect their scores to their high school. And it gave me a picture of, like, what do the high school students look like? Where are they choosing to go to high school, and connect that to their achievement level? We know we have these very high-performing, hard to get into, selective test-in high schools. And we have understood that we're probably creaming off our very top students to go to those schools. But my question was, well, to what degree what does that look like in our whole system? And also, to what degree is it happening further down sort of the food chain?
Well, what's interesting about it is that, I've followed this stuff pretty carefully for years myself, and I had no idea that we have, 150 high schools now or something?
130 the year that I looked. We now have more. And
that's astonishing. I mean, there are, and of course these are smaller schools, obviously.
Many are smaller, right? And sometimes they're schools within schools. We closed, for instance, Austin High School, and there are 3 schools in its place. We have other situations like that. We've had charter schools open. In the high school sector, charter schools have seen their greatest expansion. We have right around a quarter of our high school students are no longer being educated in district schools. They're in charter schools. That's been a very big expansion in the high school.
Of course, Barbara Bird Bennett would say those are district schools. They're CPS
they're not
schools, but they're just run by charter operators.
Correct. They're CPS schools. They're not district run, though. So I'm making the distinction between whether they're district run or run by a private operator.
So if you're a parent in Chicago today, it's fair to say that it's likely that you have a lot more choices of places where you could send your kid.
You do. You have a lot more choices. And I mean, but let's put some caveats on that. And the achievement question, let's just think about high schools for a second. If you are, let's say, a lower achiever, the places where you can go are drastically reduced. You don't qualify to test for the test-in schools. Many people don't know this, but a lot of our vocational programs actually have a minimum stay-9 requirement. You may not be able to get into those vocational programs. We have whole schools that fall into that category. So Simeon, for instance, a strong school on the south side of the city, relatively new building, a lot of respect from the community in terms of the school's history, new buildings, some very strong sports teams. They have a minimum cutoff. Not everyone can go to Simeon. So your choices are reduced. What we have had, and what I reported in this story, is we've also had charter schools that have set up barriers. Charter schools are supposed to be open to anyone. You just file an application, and you can, if you're chosen, if you're selected in a lottery, you can go. That's not exactly what has been happening in the case of some charter schools, including our largest charter high school network, which is the Noble Street Network, very high performing, lauded nationally, seen as a real treasure and a savior to many parents who are looking for good options for students who can't test into the top schools. Noble Street is seen as a strong, very focused on discipline, and producing lots of improvements in terms of college-going rates, really lots of attention focused on kids getting to college. But you, up until this school year, you could not get an application to a Noble Street High School unless you went to an information session. If you wanted your kid to apply to 4 Noble Street schools, you had to go to 4 information sessions. You've got to sign contracts. The application included an essay. Now, Noble has always said they don't use that essay to rate students or sort them in any way, but the question becomes, is even writing that essay for some kids, especially our low performers, a barrier to even apply to this school?
And you and others have reported through the last couple of years that there's also another whole kind of an insidious way that charter schools can get rid of kids that they don't want to, and that's a whole separate discussion. But certainly they have their ways. There are fees that a lot of kids can't pay, and when we get to a situation where we start seeing the schools that are bragging about having the 100% graduation or the 100% college admission or whatever it is, you look a little further down and you see that, well, not everybody who walked in the door as a freshman is making it. It's just that they're transferring out. They're going back to the district-run schools and that kind of thing. So I think this is, of all of the aspects that you've brought up in this revelation, the most important is that we really are, it's not even triaging, I don't know, is there such a word as quadraging, but we're kind of like, we're stratifying kids, and we're saying at the bottom of the barrel, where these are these kind of traditional neighborhood high schools that are, they're just kind of being relegated to being the places where the kids who, for whatever reason, can't make it into other schools just end up.
Right. And that is the biggest issue, I think, that the school district will need to grapple with. I mean, have we created a system that simply segregates out our lowest performing students and keeps those kids all in one school?
Right.
And is that better? Is that the sort of system we want? What I found was essentially like academic tracking, that we hear about, and that's debated even when it happens within a particular high school.
Sure.
You know, what we have here, what we documented was a tracking that occurs, that actually sends kids to all different schools. So you're creaming off the very top students, and then you've got sort of a second layer, and
The
again,
B students and
and again, and you have schools that are seen as sort of B schools. And I had counselors tell me, 8th grade grammar school counselors tell me that they, for instance, would not send their top students to a B school, to a B school, okay?
Right.
A relatively high-performing school that's begun to be seen as a school for B students, average students, better than average students. So I think it's an interesting dynamic, and when I found it through the reporting that researchers have documented the same phenomenon in New Orleans and in New York's public school system. It's, while we have a choice system that in theory says kids and parents will always be looking for the best option for them, what we find in fact, a consequence of that choice system is that students begin to sort themselves out based on achievement, prior achievement. And I'll also say, we've done some other reporting. This is not in the high school sort story, but it's in other prior reporting we've done. It's also fascinating to consider that under an expanded school choice system that basically says your zip code doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter that you're born in Inglewood. You can go to any school you want to. Under this system, we have more racial segregation than we had before in a neighborhood school system, or a system that was more rooted in neighborhood schools.
So the question arises: is this just simply unintended consequence, or was this some kind of policy that the Board of Education really knew was going to happen before they started doing it? Are they surprised to see this kind of automatic, or not automatic, but voluntary sorting?
Well, the school district, through the CEO, Barbara Bird Bennett, she talked about, she said she knew about the sorting prior and was concerned about it. I think the question comes down to, and this is what I've come to believe in the case of anything you care about. If you care about integration of any kind, whether it's academic integration, economic integration, or racial integration, that doesn't happen on its own, Ken. Like, we have to have a policy that says, actually, we want economic integration, and here's why, and here's what we're going to do to promote it.
And here are the steps we're going to take to make sure that happens.
It takes an intentional policy focus and intentional policies that push kids into situations that they may not choose on their own.
This is what's so fascinating to me about this. You've also written about, the proliferation of high schools means that a lot of the high schools are smaller and smaller and smaller. And as they get smaller, they lose a certain kind of an aspect that we kind of think of as being important with high school. You may not have enough kids to have a chess club or a football team, or you don't have enough diversity that you get to meet people who are not like you or don't think the way you do or aren't as fixated as you are about getting to Harvard or whatever it is. And as we remove that, we're kind of, I don't know, I have a feeling that we as a culture, we as a society are losing something.
Right. That sort of gets to the debate about what are high schools for, and what do high schools include?
Exactly.
Do they include all those extracurriculars? But I would say,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but one of the things that is like you think about the great suburban high schools. I mean, in Chicago there are lots of them, but always New Trier and Evanston and places like that come to mind. But these are massive schools with thousands of kids, and it's everybody from that town or that city or township or whatever it is. So they're all mixed up. They may be racially mixed in some cases, but they're certainly divided by achievement and all kinds of other economic forces and everything. And they're all in one place. And I think we've come to value that as being a good learning experience, haven't we? Or have we not?
Well, I think one thing that's happened under the school choice system is that we've begun to sort of romanticize the neighborhood school. And I want to point out that comprehensive neighborhood high schools in Chicago, you have to go very far back, prior basically to white flight, to get to a point where you can say comprehensive neighborhood high schools worked well for lots and lots of kids. When we have neighborhood high schools,
I don't say that, by the way. So
when we have, so I would hesitate to romanticize the idea of the large comprehensive neighborhood high schools. In many cases, especially our most distressed neighborhoods, those were high schools that were not working for a majority of kids. So I think the school district is faced with a tough question. The question of, okay, are we going to have one big neighborhood high school, and if you live in Inglewood, you've got to come here? Or are we going to create a system where, we have essentially an escape valve for our B students to get out of there? And that's everyone left is the kids who maybe made the high school tough to deal with anyways.
I understand that. I was one of those when I graduated from Stowe School here in Chicago, in 1963, but a long time ago. A counselor sat me down and said, you could go to Lane, which of course was, the North Side prep of its day, right? Or you could go, what we don't want you to do is go to Kelvin Park, because that's a terrible place and you won't like it. So you should go to Lane, or you could go to this new Prosser place that's opened up that's like vocational schooling and all that. I was not a smart enough or ambitious enough kid to make it at Lane. I would have died at Lane, and I knew that, so I went to the vocational school. But even then we were doing sorting. It's just that the options weren't that great. The choices weren't that wide.
Right. And I do want to point out one other thing about the high school options. I've lost my train of thought.
That's okay, because we can circle back into it.
Circle back, yeah.
The thing that is most important about this is to get a focus on, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Because our school system is so messed up and has been for generations, is it maybe not a bad idea to just sort of let all of the less achieving kids settle down into 5 or 6 or 10 high schools and then get in there and intensively fix those high schools? Is that maybe, is it possible that they're thinking that?
They tell me they were not thinking that, and they don't agree that that's better. That's what Barbara Bird Bennett had said. She doesn't believe that that's a better option. I also want to point out, we know from all kinds of research that schools that are filled with the lowest achieving students are very difficult schools to run. You're right, or teach in. It's the number one determinant of culture and climate in a school is actually the achievement level of the students.
Is that right?
It's not the poverty, it's not race, it's achievement level of the students. And so when you have a school that's all low achievers, you have a school where it's very difficult to set the sort of culture that promotes learning.
Because you're basically telling kids, you're here in the zoo. This is the worst of the worst, and so we don't really care about you.
And I want to point out these, you mentioned very intense services. I think that's the piece that's missing. I think whether or not, and the consortium also points this out. Elaine Allensworth talked about this with me, and it's written in the piece. Low achieving students have the most trouble in school anyways. I mean, they've been the least successful, and by high school, that takes on a lot of different sort of manifestations, that including behavior issues that affect other learners. Those students need more intensive help, whether or not they're mixed in with other kids or whether they're separated out in their own schools. Here's a point that I was going to make that I think is that I think Chicagoans should reflect on. One thing this report uncovered when we analyzed the incoming test scores of the ninth graders. So this doesn't say anything about how well the high school is done. These are tests that kids are taking a month into school. They're walking in the door, basically. We found that within neighborhoods, we know about the sorting that's happening at, that's pulling out the top kids and putting them in the Lane Techs or the North Sides or the Paytons. But what we didn't completely understand, and we have a much better picture of now, is that schools that are demographically identical and in the same neighborhood are attracting wildly different kids.
That is such an interesting discovery.
And so you have a Calvin Park. You mentioned Calvin Park. Calvin Park, I think we calculated, don't quote me exactly on the numbers, but about 20% of the kids who came into Calvin Park scored at the district, above the district average on this test.
So 80% below.
80% of the kids coming into Calvin Park, walking in the door, are below average on the district's own measure. Now, nearby, you have a very high-performing Noble Street School.
Very nearby, right? It's
very nearby. Twice as many kids come in the door, 40-some% above average. That creates a very different school going in. I think I remember looking at Calvin Park's numbers, and I think you had something like literally fewer than 10 kids scoring above average. And at the Noble School, you had 2 classrooms of kids scoring above average. That is a fundamentally
same neighborhood, same demographics.
You look at them, and then I think the conclusion that we're coming to too often, Ken, is to say, well, look at the Noble Street School. They're doing better with the same kids because their ACT scores are higher in 4 years. Their college going rate is much higher. But what we haven't looked at is where those kids started.
It's interesting, when we first got this onslaught of charter schools, we were told that the purpose of charter schools was to be laboratories, to learn things about what we can learn, what we can extrapolate for. Well, that's what they're teaching us, right? If you put a bunch of if you put more higher achieving kids into the school will probably work better than if you don't.
And I want to say, because people will say, well, you're not considering growth, right? So let's say, well, maybe the Calvin Park kids come in lower, but is Calvin Park able to boost them up more? So maybe their terminal point is not the same, but maybe they grew more. And the charter schools like to talk about
Linda
growth.
Lutton, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we only have a couple minutes left and I'm getting really nervous here. But that brings up this whole thing about school-based budgeting. If you're Calvin Park, and it sounds like we're trashing these schools, we're really not. We had George Schmidt on here talking about the schools that he's taught at. If you're Calvin Park and you're given these challenged kids, you need some resources. But the school system is saying, well, every kid gets a certain number of dollars. And so that means parents are pulling kids out of the school, the population's going down, the budget's going down, everything is falling apart for these kids.
Right, and we now have high schools that have freshman classes of 40 kids, 60 kids. These high schools are smaller than, and this is not intentional, okay? These were not started as small schools. This is Hirsch, Tilden, Richards. Calvin Park has dramatically, seen a nosedive in enrollment. We are essentially changing our school system, and the traditional school system is in complete decline, and it must shrink, and the way we're going, and the charter sector is expanding. One thing I can say if we continue on the same path, we will have to close high schools. We have too many high schools for the number of high school students we have. That's why we have...
And these big old drafty buildings, they just become really kind of a good target for closing.
Well, and we have situations where we have kids, I'll give you an example, in Inglewood, Robeson High School, I want to say fewer than 60 freshmen this year. Nearby, Noble Street, Johnson College Prep, over 200 freshmen.
Interesting.
And guess where they are? They're in a crammed primary school that was closed, Reed. Now, do we want a high school that's half empty?
It's an unfair question, but Barbara Byrd Bennett, has she done a good job? Is she going to stick around? Will she be in the second Rahm administration?
Well, I took a bet once, I think, at the Hideout.
I saw that. That's right.
McDuncan, Bendrowski. I bet no. I don't think she lives in Chicago. Actually, now I haven't gotten enough evidence to prove that, and I guess no other reporter has. But I think reporters should look at that. Whether we have a CEO who may not live in the city.
I wanted to spend about a third of the conversation talking about elementary schools. We've left it down to the last minute. Same thing is happening in elementary schools too, right? They're getting kind of sorted, and because people don't have to send their kids to the neighborhood school anymore.
Correct. Yeah. What we found was tremendous drop in buy-in to the nearby neighborhood school. Now, we found neighborhood schools still very, very important in this school landscape we have, but parents are choosing, for instance, to send their kid to a different neighborhood school, or a magnet or a charter. We've seen expansion in all those. We did a landscape that maps out the last 15 years. You can see how the school system's changed.
Which, by the way, is, I'll put it up on our website, but it's at WBEZ.org, and some of these charts are just, you can spend an hour with them. They're really, really interesting. Linda, we just gobbled up all the time. So we have a deal. You come back every 3 years and we sit down and talk about stuff, right?
All right,
so, okay, we'll see you in 2019 or whatever, 2018. Linda Lutton from WBEZ and the Spencer Foundation. We're working with, this is Spencer, right? Yes. So glad to have you here, and we'll see you real soon, I hope, sometime. Okay?
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Linda Lutton. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. And I want to tell you that if you go to CAN TV, this address that you can see right here, you can watch just about everything you need to know about the election. You can have a whole binge weekend watching forums and aldermanic debates and all that kind of stuff. It's really worth doing. A lot of work has been put into it, and I hope you'll join us on CAN TV before you make your vote. And also, if you want to watch Chicago Newsroom, you can go to this address, and you can see Chicago Newsroom anytime you want, or you can watch, or you can listen to us on iTunes. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you so much for joining us. Whatever you do, go out and vote. Some people, I won't say who, are counting on you not voting, and you shouldn't do that, okay? All right, see you next week. Bye.